We've even got a few students who chose to come because they were interested, and for you especially, we are grateful that you are here. Our Dean of Libraries, Patty Orr, has joined us. Patty, if you would stand. Thank you. And then today we have had our Keston Advisory Board meeting. So if you are part of the Keston Advisory Board, I'd like for you also to please stand. Some of these folks have traveled from, well, let's see, across the pond, as they say, to be with us, as well as from Georgia, Maine, and various other parts. Thank you so much for being with us. The chair of the Keston Advisory Board this year is Dr. Stephen Gardner, who is part of the School of Business and in Economics and the McBride Center for International Business. Steve is going to come and he is going to introduce our special speaker today.
To be more exact, I will introduce the introducer. We are some math as we're raising it to second derivatives here. And so, but first, just want to add a word to what Kathy Holman has said. I want to welcome all of you to this meeting. What I really consider to be a historic occasion, gathering together again people who've been involved in this sort of Keston enterprise since the beginning, since its founding by Michael Bourdeaux, but then also Wallace Daniel, who will introduce Michael Bourdeaux, played a most important role in sort of bringing Baylor and the Keston College, Keston Institute together, bringing the Keston Archive to Baylor back in 2007. And so I wanted to do two things. One is just to welcome all of you again, but also to call on Wallace Daniel. When he and I were approaching each other this morning to attend the advisory board meeting, Wallace said that he almost welcomed me to Baylor when he saw me, which those of you who know that Wallace is no longer at Baylor will understand sort of the irony of that. But on the other hand, he was here for 38 years, and so I'm trying to do the quick math. I've been here now for about the same amount of time that Wallace was here. But Wallace, for many years, was professor of history. He was served at various times as chairman of the history department, as director of the honors program, eventually as dean of arts and sciences, and then, woe is us, he left us in 2008 to become the provost at Mercer University, where he's now a distinguished university professor of history. So I'll call on Wallace to introduce our guest. Actually, Wallace will be our keynote speaker for a luncheon tomorrow, and so he will be introduced more fully at that time. But again, thank you all for being here. Wallace, please.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Steve, for those very kind words, and once again, welcome to Baylor. Say that. But, anyway. Ever so often, society produces a person of uncommon vision. A person who is able to see far more in the distance than most of the rest of us. Such a person imagines the future in ways that are uncommon. Future in its needs, future in what others cannot see. Such a person is Michael Bourdeaux. As a young graduate student in the former Soviet Union in 1959 and 60, Michael Bourdeaux was on the first British exchange program with the then Soviet Union. He entered a society, of course, that was formerly closed, to Westerners at least, and as a student there, he began to sense the outline of a story, of a great story that few in the Western media, few scholars were able to see. And thinking that it might be significant, he purchased on the streets of Moscow one day a journal titled Nauka и Religia, Science and Religion, which ultimately became the leading journal in Khrushchev's campaign to obliterate religion in the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union. He began to collect other materials, books, documents, testimonies, first-hand accounts of a story few were telling, a story whose importance grew exponentially over time, of the relationship of church and state, of the persecution of religious believers, the personal testimonies of hundreds of people whose struggles would be lost except for the vision and the courage of Michael Bourdeaux. From its early days in Chislehurst in England, where he founded the Center for the Study of Religion and Communism, to an old parish school in Keston, to Oxford, Michael Bourdeaux built one of the finest, richest, most extensive, and remarkable archives of religion, politics, and society, and freedom of conscience that we have in the former and present communist world. His contributions extend much beyond that significant achievement. He is the founder of a major journal, Religion in Communist Lands, today, of course, the journal Religion, State, and Society. He's the author or editor, at my count, of 9 books, an enormous number of articles and essays, a writer for 5 English newspapers, a contributor to the BBC. He is not only a scholar, he is ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church, and he was awarded the prestigious Templeton Prize in 1984. And if these were not enough, he sang for 30 years in England's Philharmonic Chorus and served for 25 years as an international tennis umpire at Wimbledon, New York, and also Melbourne. If I might add a personal word, Michael Bourdeaux's work has inspired a large number of students of religion and politics globally. As a person of vision, he has provided a panoramic view of a never-ending story of the struggle for religious freedom on a global scale. In my first year at Baylor, 1972, Michael Bourdeaux came to this university to give a series of lectures. I had the privilege of introducing him during my first year here, and today, after all these years, it is an honor to do so again. I present to you Reverend Canon Michael Bourdeaux.
Professor Daniel and many friends, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be back at Baylor and to be speaking in a public lecture all those years after I first came here to present what was then called the series, the Dawson Lectures on Church and State. And when I came all those years ago, it never seemed to me a remote possibility. It never entered my head that one day there would be a center here which would hold the archive that my colleagues and I spent many years of our lives building up. And I congratulate Baylor on the achievement of not only receiving that archive, but preserving it. And as we heard in our board meeting this morning, having plans to continue work on the archive, to digitize it, to present it to the world for scholarship in the future. The general subject of this afternoon's and tomorrow's conference, Religion and Political Culture in Communist Countries, Past, Present and Future. Well, that embraces the whole archive that is here, a few hundred yards from where we speak, and much more besides. I was given a free hand to choose a topic within that vast panorama. And what I thought I would do this afternoon is to talk about the situation in the Soviet Union in the immediate pre-Gorbachev years, building up to those cataclysmic events which would eventually see the overthrow of communism. And as I was to some extent a personal witness of what was going on, I've entitled my lecture, Gorbachev and the Church After 25 Years, Some Facts and Personal Reminiscences. Today, I want to scan the horizons of the Church in the Soviet Union, touring some of the areas as though from an aerial perspective. I have two theses. The first is that religion played a greater role in the collapse of the Soviet system than is generally realized. The second thesis is that the role of religious dissent in the Russian Orthodox Church in the 1970s and the 80s awaits a full and honest and more comprehensive evaluation than it has yet received, not least on the part of the Moscow Patriarchate, the leading body of the Orthodox Church in Russia today. But for the first part of our tour, we are going to focus on the Soviet Baltic republics of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in that order. I pass over as a given your knowledge of the persecution of religion under Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev, although there is still much to be recovered from the archives about that history. But the general outlines are well known. The imprisonment of church leaders, the widespread closure of places of worship, the abolition of religious education, the banning of charitable work, and later, the collaboration of some religious bodies with the regime was a feature which had long been imposed on the Soviet Union after the second occupation of the Baltic republics towards the end of the Second World War. Then, when those Soviet republics fell, when the Baltic republics fell for a second time under communism during the Second World War, after occupation by the Germans, something had to be done by the Soviet authorities quickly to bring them into line with those parts of the Soviet Union which had been communist since 1917. The first answer to that question, the first practical attempt by the Soviet authorities to reduce the Baltic peoples to a leaderless and miserable non-entity was, of course, deportation. Deportation of tens of thousands of people from those Baltic states to Siberia. A story which has been more or less documented. But I want to move on from that to the later consequences of these attempts by the authorities, and to talk about the attempts by the people of the Baltic republics, especially those who were Christian believers, to regain their lost liberty in the 1970s and especially the 80s, a subject which is much documented in the resources held here now at the Keston Center. But there is still a great deal of work which can be done, needs to be done, by examination of the archives in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union itself. I made a hurried attempt to do so in my book, Gorbachev, Glasnost and the Gospel, published when the issues were far short of resolution in 1990. I will consider the three Baltic republics in order, starting with Latvia. Except for a significant Catholic minority in Latgalia, the majority of the Latvian population had been Lutheran before the inroads of enforced atheism. The rump of the church survived, but only just, and with a passive leadership which appeared content with the limited degree of liberty permitted by the Soviet state. The authorities granted leave to the bishops, the Lutheran bishops, to attend international conferences in the 60s and 70s, such as those organized by the World Council of Churches. They gave assurances that the Soviet republics of Latvia and Estonia enjoyed freedom of worship, and all seemed quiet on the Baltic front. This was to change significantly in 1985, just at the time of Gorbachev's accession. The Soviet authorities controlled church life partly by monitoring the students who applied to the one Lutheran theological seminary now allowed to operate. A bright young student by the name of Maris Ludvigs was in trouble with the local Council for Religious Affairs, the communist agency which governed church affairs and looked after appointments and so on. He was in trouble because he had engaged as a young man in energetic youth work. He was a youth leader. Traditionally, when such a conflict arose, the Soviet authorities would always win, and they would remove the unruly element by one means or another. But this time in Latvia, it was different. Although the Lutheran leaders weakly caved in and refused to ordain this young man who was studying at the theological seminary, he left Latvia and crossed what was really a non-existent border at that time into Lithuania. Lithuania is not known for its Lutheran minority, but there is one, and among them there was a Lutheran bishop. And he, being a Lithuanian, and as you will hear later in my presentation, therefore an extremely strong and outspoken man, ordained the young Ludvigs, and he became a pastor in the Latvian church. The Soviet authorities in Latvia were absolutely furious at the events which had taken place without their knowledge. He did not imagine, Pastor Ludvigs, that the conflict that he set up with the authorities would set in train a series of events which would eventually lead to the reopening of Riga Cathedral. It had been transformed into a concert hall, and indeed a national revival of the church. The so-called rebirth and renewal movement in the Latvian Lutheran Church came into being. It was coincidental that there was a hiatus in the leadership of the Latvian Church. Archbishop Matulis had just died. His successor, Eric Mesters, equally acceptable to, or maybe appointed by, the regime, had not yet been consecrated. Archbishop Mesters caved in and refused to appoint the young Pastor Ludvigs to a parish. In typical form, the Latvian newspaper Padomju Jaunatne, Soviet Youth in translation, published a scurrilous attack against him. How many such attacks there were against Christians in the Soviet press in the 1980s and going back several years before that to Khrushchev's renewed persecution of religion. They called him in this article a black marketeer, a work-shy parasite, and thereby they shot themselves in the foot. Enter Pastor Modris Plate, still in his early 30s, who organized a group of 5 clergy, outstandingly brave men, to visit the editorial offices of this newspaper to protest against the calumny. The rest, as they say, is history, but I will comment a little on it. Eduards Kokas Trops, the head of the Latvian Council of Religious Affairs, doing communist bidding, lent on Archbishop Mesters to dismiss Pastor Plate, who already had a good following locally. And this infuriated more and more people. 19 clergy signed a petition for the reinstatement of Pastor Plate on the 18th of March 1987. 350 lay people joined in the protest, and Pastor Plate stood his ground. Soon a non-religious protest group joined in, the Helsinki Monitors. Samizdat, self-published, privately circulated, Christian literature began to proliferate. It had not been seen before in Latvia. In Russia, it was already enjoying a wide currency, but not in Latvia. An even younger pastor, Juris Rubenis, who became my personal friend, called for the reopening of the cathedral. The state yielded, not only permitting a service to be held, because by this time they were on the back foot, but even, amazingly, televising it. There was now no going back. A democratically elected consistory, that is a meeting of the senior clergy, came together on the 11th of April 1988 and voted Archbishop Mesters out of office. His replacement was Archbishop Carlis Galaitis, only 53 years old, who openly supported the national Latvian independence movement. The goal of freedom of religion for Latvians was now firmly in sight, and the Lutheran Church played a significant role in achieving it. And on a wider scale, clearly a move towards the complete political independence of Latvia. I moved to Estonia. The Soviets long considered that the claimed pacification of Estonia was an achievement of socialism. The majority Lutheran church there seemed weaker than its Latvian counterpart. But in church-state relations, the first focus in Estonia was on the promotion and eventual elevation to the patriarchate of Alexei Mikhailovich Rydiger, born in 1929, who was to become Patriarch of Moscow, eventually Alexis II. He later claimed that his religious views were formed during the free years when Estonia was not under Soviet authority. He said he wanted to become a priest in the Orthodox Church from the age of 6. We don't know exactly how or when he was compromised. What is certain is that at the Leningrad Seminary in 1947, he was singled out for a purpose: to pacify, to Kremlinize, if you like, the large Orthodox minority in Estonia, converting them from being Estonian Orthodox to Russian Orthodox, and thereby to make that great cathedral in Tallinn the symbol of Russian domination over the Estonians. At the age of 32 in 1961, Alexei became the youngest bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church, first in Tallinn, then other appointments, eventually holding the very high post of Metropolitan of Leningrad, 1986, and then election as Patriarch Alexei the Second in 1990. Abroad, he became the best-known Russian church leader. His extensive international role with the World Council of Churches, and especially the Conference of European Churches, frequently took him abroad on his travels. In his public statements made around the world, he consistently concealed the persecution of the church, which continued while he was in his heyday in the 1970s. Looking back, I estimate that his role was to suppress not only knowledge abroad of religious dissent in the USSR, but also to suppress potential dissent itself in his homeland of Lithuania, of Estonia. And I think that's an important point. He became the archetypal Soviet man whose core was compromise, but at the same time, jealously preserving that degree of religious liberty permitted by Soviet atheism. He was, in his heart, I think, also a sincere Christian. But a full biography is one of the many tasks awaiting today's scholars. There are many things, many works which can be and need to be undertaken fully to illuminate this period, this crucial period in church-state relations and the history of the last days of the Soviet Union. However, Estonia, despite Alexei, was not as passive as he was himself, and not as passive as his Soviet masters would have liked the world to believe. Various elements, not least in the Russian Orthodox Church itself, but even in the small Roman Catholic Church in Estonia, were beginning to coalesce. The Catholic composer Arvo Pärt was forced into exile for writing Christian liturgical music, which caused dissent among the artistic community in Estonia. It's a mistake, I think, to confine one's study when looking at these years to purely church matters. A wider cultural perspective is often very helpful to illuminate what we're trying to discover. There was also unrest and religious revival among the very small Methodist Church, the only place in the Soviet Union where it existed. And there, a pastor, Olaf Pernemets, began most successfully and fearlessly to organize youth work in the 1970s. He was warned by the KGB for doing so, but nevertheless permitted in carrying it out. In the Lutheran Church, the majority church in Estonia, a man called Harry Mertsnik horrified the Soviet establishment by giving up a distinguished law career to become a Lutheran pastor and a remarkable preacher. With his experience of public speaking, he was especially effective, and his gospel included strong elements of Estonian nationalism. How about this from a pre-perestroika sermon? I quote, "It is relevant to remember the noble path of self-sacrifice of those who have chosen the struggle for freedom as the only way of hope for the Estonian people, setting on one side the fear which they surely experience within and in the face of the totalitarian regime which confronts them." The KGB, end of quote. The KGB, of course, targeted Harry Mertsnik. He, so-called, repented and was forced into exile in Sweden. Yet his message galvanized hundreds, possibly more, of young people. They flocked to hear his sermons while he was still preaching. What had seemed a passive church was now throbbing with new life in the 1980s. And here is something else awaiting fuller research. The whole story of the revival of the Estonian Lutheran Church has not yet been fully told. Almost out of the blue, an ecumenical group calling itself the Rock of Support formed in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, in 1987 to defend all believers throughout the USSR. Very outgoing and forward-looking people were the Estonians, still are. This group, using a little bit of freedom of communication which began to develop in the Gorbachev era, contacted me directly and asked if they could work with Keston College as we published their information. And these were exciting times to receive these direct communications from Estonia and to be able to proclaim what they wanted to tell the world. Their role has received little publicity since, but deserves, again, re-examination. But they were far from being the sole stimulus for the Estonian well-known singing revolution, which did receive worldwide publicity and eventual success. But the voice of the church was always present during these turbulent years. So even pacified Estonia, as the Soviets thought they were, picked up the pace as dissent gathered strength in the neighboring republics of Latvia and, of course, Lithuania to the south. I turn my attention to Lithuania. This small nation truly became the Achilles heel of the Soviet system. And I hardly need here to emphasize the potent link between Catholic dissent and Sąjūdis, which in Lithuanian means movement, movement for Gorbachev's reforms. And of course, being a neighbor to much larger nation of Poland, there was influence from the Catholic Church across the border. This Sąjūdis movement was a covert title for independence. There is no time here even to begin to document the rise of dissent in the 1970s, but this story, a fuller story of the church's involvement in it, is written in my book, Land of Crosses, published in 1979. I want to quote a single example which must stand for what could be hundreds, even thousands, chosen at random out of the multiple instances documented fully in the chronicle of the Lithuanian Catholic Church, a full set of which in Lithuanian, but also they produced Russian language translations preserved here in the Keston Center. This example makes it absolutely clear that the Catholic Church, its leadership, was never compromised in the way that other denominations, more or less, at times, became subservient throughout the Soviet Union. I'm going to pull out of this mass of material the case of Father Juozas Zdebskis. And this was reported in the very first issue of this amazing samizdat series of documents, a chronicle of the Lithuanian Catholic Church, which circulated from hand to hand clandestinely throughout Lithuania and began as early as the 1970s to galvanize the nation. The first issue was in 1971, and it highlighted the case of Father Juozas Zdebskis. He was arrested for the third time in that year, 71, for teaching the catechism to children at their parents' request. He had already had an extensive record of fearlessly upholding the faith, so a 10-year sentence at least might have been expected. However, in the face of manifest public support for him on the streets of the cities of Lithuania, he was given a much shorter sentence, only 1 year for teaching religion, teaching catechism to the children at the request of their parents. His trial was secretly recorded by a friend and supporter who got into the trial room. Usually friends were excluded from such trials, but somebody got in, wrote down probably shorthand notes and wrote it up afterwards, a more or less full transcript of the trial, and there it appeared in the first ever issue of the Chronicle of the Lithuanian Catholic Church. An amazing development in the human rights movement, not only in Lithuania, but in the Soviet Union as a whole. He was sentenced only to a year of imprisonment, as I said, and on his release, he walked on a carpet of flowers, which was strewn on the pathway outside the prison, and dozens, possibly hundreds of children, accompanied by their parents, came to make that demonstration. In 1978, he became a founder member of the Catholic Committee for the Defense of Believers' Rights, and this new step in his public work soon led, sadly, to his death and martyrdom. After several brutal attacks of various sorts against him, he died in a so-called road accident in February 1986. At his death, apart from a Bible and a few other Christian books, his sole prized possession, his little library, the only thing that his friends and supporters and parishioners found in a drawer was a collection of small rocks which he had picked up in various parts of his native land. His little treasure. He had witnessed the beginning of Gorbachev's era, but not the independence which his country gained at the end of it. One wonders why he and others like him are not in the forefront of the current rush in the Vatican to create modern saints. Perhaps the new Pope will pay attention to Lithuania. The Lithuanian Church achieved its liberty at great cost of suffering. Not only Father Zdebskis, but thousands of others were interrogated, many of them imprisoned. Some did not survive imprisonment even in the 1970s and the 1980s. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, in about 1986, a year after he arrived in full control, if he ever had full control, in the Kremlin, he began releasing political prisoners and religious prisoners. But it's quite remarkable that the Lithuanians initially were not released. They were considered too dangerous to the Soviet authorities. And the Bishop of Vilnius, by the name of Julijonas Stepanavicius, was released only at the end of 1988, after how many years? 27 years, no less, of house arrest. He'd never been tried. But in 1988, the end of that year, he was able to come back to Vilnius, which was already awash with new signs of freedom. Parishes were being regained, Christian books were being published, charitable activities revived, monastic orders reinstated. The bishop himself said that his first task would be the reconsecration of Vilnius Cathedral. It had been successively an atheist museum, a bookstore, and an art gallery. By February 1989, Professor Vytautas Landsbergis and other leaders of the Sąjūdis movement were installed in an office in a house opposite the cathedral. I can still see in my mind's eye, because I was there, being outside the cathedral and looking up and seeing for the first time the man who was to become the first president, the first elected, freely elected leader of a former communist state in the Soviet Union. It was my privilege to be there at the invitation of the newly freed Archbishop. Apart from some representatives from the Russian Church, I was the only foreign guest present at that momentous event of the reconsecration of the cathedral. When the authorities permitted a live TV program, a broadcast of the whole 3-hour event, this was not the beginning of the end of Soviet domination of Lithuania. It was virtually the end of the Soviet Union itself, certainly the ties between Lithuania and the Kremlin. Events moved irresistibly from one phase to the next. Lithuania witnessed the last murder of its own citizens by the special forces a few months later. But even this was too late to stem the tide. Sąjūdis became the elected government, and it declared independence long before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which of course formalized the independence of Lithuania in 1991. Nowhere in the Soviet Union had the movement for change been more powerful. Nowhere had the Christian voice played a more decisive role in the development of political events. The Catholic Church had openly embraced politics because it was fighting for religious freedom, and religious freedom meant an end of Soviet domination. There was, of course, this was on a smaller scale than the parallel events taking place at the same time in Poland, but it was no less potent within the Lithuanian community. Religion in the 1980s by sociologists worldwide was popularly but mistakenly viewed to be a dying force. But historians whose work is honed by the new realities of the 21st century are likely to reevaluate the role of religion, not least in the Baltic states, leading up to the collapse of communism. Finally, I turn my attention to Russia. Evaluating the role of religious dissent and striving towards democracy in Russia itself is a much more difficult task than what I've been saying relevant to the 3 Baltic states. Some scholars, such as Professor Archie Brown of Oxford University, dismiss the role of dissent as a whole, not just religious dissent, as a factor in the collapse of Soviet communism. I hold a different view. It is impossible here to summarize all the evidence. It's already been done in some of Keston's publications in English and complete set held here, but it needs to be reassessed by the wider scholarly community. This is where the work of the Keston Center here at Baylor will continue to be so very important and will develop greater importance in the future. Historical scholarship in Russia on the period from Khrushchev's assault on religion beginning in 1959 to the rise of perestroika about a year after Gorbachev's accession in 1985 has been weak. In 1990, doing my research on the role of religion while perestroika was still in full swing, I published the book to which I referred, Gorbachev, Glasnost and the Gospel, but I intended it simply as a piece of unfinished work, almost journalism, if you like to put it that way, and I was sure it would soon be superseded by more in-depth studies. By and large, this has not happened, to my eternal surprise. Most of all, one might have expected the now free Russian Orthodox Church to begin to pay minute attention to what immediately preceded its contemporary gains, which of course, as you all know, are considerable, indeed total. The reason for this lacuna is almost certainly a guilt complex. The Russian Orthodox Church leadership was to a certain extent larger or smaller, collaborating with the Soviet authorities. And that is a story which today they cannot even bear fully to research and to publicize. The inevitable outcome is that the true heroes of the faith in Russia itself are rapidly disappearing into the mists of history without the establishment of a true memorial to their podvig. Podvig is a wonderful Russian word which means a heroic deed in a Christian context. There were many religious dissenters in the Orthodox Church in the 60s, 70s and 80s who carried out acts of podvig. They are heroic figures and they need to be better known. As time goes on, the number of those still alive dwindles and the opportunities of documenting oral histories are missed. The inevitable outcome is that the true heroes of the faith are not as highlighted as they should be. As a rare example, let's take Father Gleb Yakunin, who first publicly challenged Nikita Khrushchev's atheist campaign in the mid-1960s. He is the sole survivor of a group who undertook an act of astonishing bravery at the time. He's now in his 80th year. As a young priest in a Moscow parish in the early 1960s, he began with his colleague, the late Father Nikolai Eshliman, and others, systematically to gather information about the renewed persecutions under Khrushchev nationwide. Father Gleb sounded out senior priests as to why there was no opposition to Khrushchev's new brutal measures. 11 or so priests promised support. Father Gleb collected information from visitors to Moscow who often came bearing their petitions to the government. But when he published his sensational but objective documents in 1965, this support, could somebody open that for me, please? When he published his sensational but objective documents in 1965, this support quietly evaporated, thank you, and the signatures of the two priests alone appeared under their open letters to the Kremlin and to Patriarch Alexei I. The two priests wrote, quotation selected from voluminous documents, one sent to the Kremlin, another to the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. The two priests wrote these words: "No fewer than 10,000 churches and dozens of monasteries have been closed, among which we should especially mention the Monastery of the Caves at Kiev, the most ancient sacred place of our Orthodox people. The mass closure of churches, a campaign instigated from above, has created an atmosphere of anti-religious fanaticism, which has led to the barbaric destruction of a large number of superb and unique monuments." These amazing words were written and sent to the Kremlin in the light of the immediate years of persecution under Khrushchev. Khrushchev was ousted from office just about the time that these documents were written. This reads like a blueprint for the demands of the perestroika period more than 20 years later. Father Gleb's career suffered. Indeed, he had no future within the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate. From that time on, the Patriarch silenced him under the thumb of the Council for Religious Affairs, inevitably. He was eventually imprisoned and disowned completely by the Moscow Patriarchate. He survived just due to his undaunted bravery and determination. I think here is another biography waiting to be written. Such a work, if it existed, would describe the atmosphere of increasing boldness which the activities of the two priests would arouse, the rise of religious dissent. To list these names today is to make a roll call of heroic activity. Here are some names from the 70s and the 80s. There are multiple documents, probably thousands of pages of documents, just a few hundred yards from where I'm speaking, relating to these men and the occasional woman too. Father Alexander Mien, a contemporary and friend of Father Gleb Yakunin, who never became a dissident as such, but was nevertheless murdered in 1990 in circumstances never fully investigated. He's an exception to the generalization that there's been no serious study of his role, and Professor Daniel is in the later stages of producing a full biography. The layman, Alexander Ogorodnikov, who became a student convert from communist activism and established a Christian seminar discussion group, which rapidly spread from Moscow to many regional centers. His biography, called A Dissident for Life, was published this year by Konrad de Wolf, translation from Dutch. He is going to visit Baylor quite soon. He's been given a scholarship to come and look at some of his documents. They were all confiscated by the KGB. We preserved copies of them at Keston in the UK, and they're now here and can be fully and completely studied. He's coming to look up his own life history. I hope you'll take good advantage of his presence when he is here next year. Boris Talantov, another layman, a maths teacher from the northern city of Kirov, Vyatka, who documented Khrushchev's persecution of religion in his region with the same assiduity which Fathers Eshleman and Yakunin practiced on a nationwide scale. He died in prison. Ksenia Denin, who comes here from time to time, has met a Russian in Vyatka who is working on his biography. Anatoly Levitin, another layman, who was formerly a deacon in the Living Church. His particular interest was in the education of young people in the faith. For doing this in practice and for circulating his voluminous works in Samizdat, he too lost his job, was imprisoned and forced into exile in Switzerland, where he died, being mysteriously run over by a car. Irina Ratushinskaya, a laywoman, almost totally innocent of any crime, even by the debased standards which existed in Brezhnev's Russia. She almost died as a young prisoner for having, as a school teacher, written a handful of Christian poems. She became a cause célèbre, partly because of her brilliance as a poet, partly because of the fact, quite rightly, that she was a woman, and eventually her life was saved by the political intervention of Mrs. Thatcher, our Prime Minister, who consulted with us about the events concerning her life, and we were able to provide biography and ongoing information which we received from her husband, who was not imprisoned and was to some extent a free man in Kiev. The great preacher and teacher, Father Dmitry Dudko, finally had a tragic fate. He is the subject of another biography which has appeared this year, called The Last Man in Russia by Oliver Bourdeaux. He was perhaps the most outspoken and influential of all the dissident Orthodox priests, but who renounced his political and disloyal activities after terrible maltreatment in prison. And of course, his denunciation of his own past was a terrible blow to his followers. But his work in the person of his disciples lives on. Father Pavel Adelheim, who became a dear friend of mine, was a fearless critic of the atheist regime, who actually managed to build a church in remote Uzbekistan just after the Khrushchev era. He survived several attempts in the Soviet Union on his life, carried out a fruitful ministry, supported financially from abroad, from a parish in the UK. He moved after his final imprisonment to Pskov, where he carried out a quite outstanding youth ministry. Only this year, in August, he was murdered in his own kitchen by a young assailant. As far as we know, no political motive, but who knows what really lay behind that disastrous attack on a 75-year-old defenseless man in his own house, who had taken in this young man who had mental problems and tried to become a substitute father to him. Another name who could be much more studied, a hero of the faith. Other names that one might mention, and about whom a great deal really is known, but not so much written. Father Vsevolod Shpiler, parish priest in Moscow. Vadim Shavrov, graduate of the Odessa Theological Seminary, who remained a layman. Vladimir Osipov, editor of the samizdat journal Vecher, Signposts. Igor Shafarevich, a mathematician, many others. There is a long roll call of the heroes of the faith within the Orthodox Church, but they never coalesced into a movement. But a special category must, of course, be set aside for the literary world, above all, the towering figure of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, by no means the only Christian author of those days, but head and shoulders above everyone else in his moral leadership, which stood out for all those difficult years. All these Christian voices associated with the Orthodox Church form a pattern, and a complex one at that, but they do not represent a movement, except perhaps in the single case of Alexander Ogorodnikov's Christian Seminar. It's still open for discussion how far these men and women, very active in his seminar, contributed to the intellectual atmosphere of the mid-1980s. And this led directly to the Christian voice within the perestroika movement. Not a single one of the priests in the Orthodox Church who participated in these brave and heroic podvigi, as I've described them, was ever given what you could call ecclesiastical preferment. They were either suppressed by their own church, or they were given very humble livings way out in the countryside. Not one of them became a bishop or a figure of international leadership or even national leadership. In the Baltic states, I'm glad to report, the opposite happened. It's of immense significance, though, that the Moscow Patriarchate, immediately at the beginning of perestroika, began to prepare to cultivate the ground which the reformists had so painfully prepared in the preceding 2 decades. Mikhail Gorbachev was not himself a believer, but the demands for religious liberty which the Church Democrats forced onto his early agenda undoubtedly had a profound influence on his policy. His first liberal act in the religious sphere was the release of prisoners, which I mentioned, first in a trickle, and then in 1987, and then a spate from 1988 onwards. Indeed, this latter date provided, from many points of view, the fulcrum which levied the pressure which caused the dam to burst. If one were to seek one key moment in church-state relations in these years, it would be the 29th of April 1988, when Mikhail Gorbachev received the leading bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, now finally finding a voice. A bit late, but finding a voice nevertheless. They were received by Gorbachev in the Kremlin. It's a subject of some dispute, whether Gorbachev himself initiated this event or whether it occurred in response to an initiative from the Orthodox Church itself. I think it was probably Gorbachev who initiated this because the patriarch of the time, the pliant Patriarch Pimen, was still in office, and he'd never lifted a finger in his life to support any cause connected with religious liberty. Be that as it may, the date, 29th of April 1988, was doubly significant. Firstly, it was the 59th anniversary to the day of when Stalin's new repressive laws on religion of 1929 were introduced. Secondly, it was the only occasion in Soviet history when any church leader had been invited to meet the Kremlin leadership. The first occasion was on the 4th of September 1943, when Stalin acknowledged the role of the Orthodox Church in defending the war effort in the Great Patriotic War. On that occasion, Stalin gave permission for the election of a patriarch after a gap of 25 years and the establishment of this new body, the Moscow Patriarchate. Gorbachev, in his turn, was to proclaim something momentous when he invited the leaders of the Orthodox Church to meet him in the Kremlin. What he promised on that occasion was the abolition of the Stalinist legislation, which I've just mentioned, and which indeed he was to bring about in 1990. There's not a study of that in my book on Gorbachev, because the laws came into force just about the time that the book was published, but they abolished all restrictions on religion. Gorbachev at that meeting admitted that the state had made grave mistakes in its relations with the church. He didn't use the word persecution, but he implied it. He went on to say this, I quote, "Believers are Soviet people, workers, patriots, and they have the full right to express their convictions with dignity. Perestroika, democratization, and glasnost concern believers as well as us communists, in full measure and without any restrictions. This is especially true in the field of ethics and morals, a domain where universal norms and customs are so helpful to our common cause." No leader of a communist country in history had ever hinted that there could be a common cause between Christianity and communism. Of course, Gorbachev was not to survive long enough for the effects of what he said to work out in practice. But it is a very interesting statement, nevertheless. I'd like to see more written about Gorbachev's relation to Christianity. The church, though, was far from ready to work out the practical bases of such cooperation. But this was the moment at which the demands of the Democrats now passed unacknowledged into the mouths of the church leadership. By an astonishing coincidence of history, 1988 was also the year in which the baptism of the Eastern Slavs would be celebrated in double short order and with every assistance from the state. The Russian state, the Kievan state, having accepted baptism, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, in 988. And here, 1,000 years later, an amazing turn of the wheel of history was about to take place. The Soviet state, from Mikhail Gorbachev himself down to local officials of the Council of Religious Affairs, and of course the church leadership, all turned their attention to making the celebration of the millennium of the baptism of Russia a priority, an international event of major significance. It was a breathless time. Buildings were painted even if there wasn't time to repair them. Organizing teams were appointed. International invitations were sent out. Breathlessly and amazingly, the Russian Orthodox Church was ready, more or less, to receive a bevy of international guests, headed by such luminaries as Cardinal Willebrands from the Vatican, Billy Graham from this country, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Runcie from my own country. I was due to join them, but the KGB still retained control of the visa blacklist. My task was to lead a group of so-called pilgrims from the UK to go and celebrate the millennium of the church. My visa was issued and then annulled by a telephone call from the Soviet embassy. The KGB still held the final say-so on visas, and my visa was cancelled. Enter the Foreign Office, who must have said something like this to the Soviet authorities: if you think this is the age of perestroika and you're excluding Michael Bourdeaux from these celebrations, you must be joking. I don't think our Foreign Office was quite as crude as that, but they certainly overturned the decision. And at 9 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock, midnight, Moscow, a call came through from the Soviet embassy in London to my house in the suburbs saying, Michael Bourdeaux, your visa has just been received from Moscow. You can join the plane tomorrow. The plane was due to leave in about 10 hours from then. I hadn't packed a stitch. I had to get to the embassy to collect the visa and also to go to the airport by 7 and check in at about 5 the next morning. No sleep was had in the Bourdeaux household, but we managed to get there, my wife and I, with our group of pilgrims to celebrate this great event of the millennium. It was a frenetic experience. And I want to close just by quoting one or two things that happened. Here is an account of the final day that I was in Moscow, when the church and the state came together in a con-celebration of their newfound union in the Bolshoi Theatre. This event was in fact going to take place twice. There was a kind of dress rehearsal and then the big event the next day. But I was privileged to receive a ticket for the so-called dress rehearsal, but we went through all the program and it was a memorable experience. This is how I described it in my book. The day ended with a Jubilee concert in the presence of dignitaries representing both church and state. Raisa Gorbachev and President Gromyko, very influential at the time, were the most noble secular figures present. I was present the previous evening before a slightly less official audience. My wife and I were there, the Moscow Patriarchate having provided us with tickets. We sat in the second row of the stalls to witness a revelation. No fewer than 7 choirs, 6 orchestras, and some of the stars of the Soviet screen and concert platform combined in a joint celebration of the millennium by church and state. To witness the best choirs of the Russian Orthodox Church alternating with the finest secular choruses was to see a new era in microcosm. There have been thousands of evenings when the Bolshoi atmosphere has sparked electricity. Rarely can it have been more charged than it was then. Nuns from Riga and Kiev with whom I talked were given the opportunity to see and hear something which would remain with them for the rest of their days. And at the end of the celebration, not only the curtains had been opened, but the top of the very top of the Bolshoi Theatre revealed when another set of curtains high up opened, a set of bells, and they pealed out, especially symbolical, because bells had been long since forbidden to be rung in the Soviet Union. And here they were pealing out and proclaiming a new relationship between church and state. The outcome of all this was that all restrictions on religion were very shortly to be abolished by Gorbachev when the new law was introduced 2 years later, and they would never be the same again. But to round off, as you know, creeping authoritarianism would soon begin to assert itself, this time within the newly free fortress of the Moscow Patriarchate. And that, again, is a story which needs to be told and retold. The Russian Orthodox Church, having gained its freedom, managed to overturn in 1997 Gorbachev's law and President Yeltsin's new and much more restrictive law on religion was introduced by the under pressure, undoubtedly, from the Russian Orthodox Church. But that's another story which must belong to another lecture. Thank you very much. Yes, of course.
Reverend Bourdeaux has consented to answer a question or two. Do we have a question from the audience? I have one. You sort of hinted toward the present and the future, talking about creeping authoritarianism. What would be your feelings now about the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the government connected to Vladimir Putin?
Well, the inner workings of that relationship are not known, but from an exterior point of view, one can gauge that those relations are close. The key thing, as far as I can see, is not that Putin himself says a great deal about the role of the church, but the Orthodox Church under the bishops is unremittingly supportive of the policy of the Russian state. You can look at some of the key events where you might expect to see some kind of dissentient voice at high level. If you can go back and remember the incidents of the Falklands War, in which the British government or the British forces were involved in liberating the Falklands from the invading Argentines, there was tremendous criticism by our Archbishop Runcie and bishops below him of the English intervention. Whether they were right or not, I'm not going to argue, but there was immediate criticism. And Mrs. Thatcher was very, very annoyed with the order of service which took place in St. Paul's Cathedral, which called for peace with the Argentinians in a way that the British going beyond what the British government was proclaiming. Now, I quote that example because the Russian government has never been subjected to anything similar from the increasingly powerful Orthodox Church. What could it have done? Well, a few years ago, there was the devastating series of interventions in Chechnya, the Russian Republic, which is predominantly Muslim and which wanted to break away from Kremlin domination. The Russian forces, in two separate waves, first under Yeltsin, then under Putin, stepped in and devastated the local population. not a single word of criticism from the Russian Orthodox Church. Indeed, the Church blessed the forces as they went off to fight and to kill their own citizens. Similarly, very recently, within the last couple of years, what might have eventuated if the Russian Orthodox Church, if only one bishop had spoken out in criticism of the Kremlin's support for Syria. That might have changed the course of history, but that has simply not happened. How does it not happen? Well, there is a tradition within the Orthodox Church that it supports the governments of the time, which had tragic consequences, obviously, during the communist period. But that mindset pervades even today, and a priest who speaks out will never reach any higher relationship, any higher position in the church. He will be consigned to some far-off parish, and of course you have the situation in the Orthodox Church where only monks can become bishops, married priests cannot, and that is a problem too, but it's a slightly separate problem. The leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church has done virtually nothing in recent years to give a more humane face to developing Russian politics, and I think it could have done, and in my view, the Russian Orthodox Church needs reformation root and branch. Another question there.
What about Solzhenitsyn? Was he more of a help or a hindrance to this whole business?
Solzhenitsyn was always the cat that walked by itself. I knew him. I met him a couple of times. He wrote the foreword, actually, for one of my books, or commended it or something. I had tremendous admiration for him. He managed to proclaim Christianity, first of all, in a form which could evade the Soviet censorship. His great book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, showed the power of prayer in a Russian prison camp, and that book was published and became a huge sensation in the Soviet Union in 1962. You can almost talk about the Soviet Union pre-Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and post. As a result of that book, he became not only known but controversial, and he did publish a series of essays which were also outspoken, but after that he couldn't publish anything more in the Soviet Union, and his books became only freely available after the collapse of communism and in present-day Russia. I don't think that he managed to carry out the leadership role in post-Soviet Russia that he might have promised. But that's partly because he was an old man, and partly I think he had done so much. He did not have the independence of mind. He went back to live in Russia and was first of all given a television program, but he kept on saying the same thing on the program and was rapidly edited out. He did not have the influence in personal influence that he had had previously, but his books live on. Nobel Prize for Literature, Templeton Prize, and in my opinion, a very great man who offered leadership and independence of thought to the literary community, and that was a great deed in its own right.
Well, thank you, Reverend Bourdeaux, for traveling, as Kathy said, across the pond one additional time to share these thoughts with us. thank you even more for what you and others have done to collect this archive that's now in the able care of the Baylor library system. This is a responsibility and an honor, I think, for Baylor University to have this opportunity to work with these materials, with the list of people that you've talked. We are now connected to, in many ways, to this entire sort of cloud of witnesses that you referred to. We're honored to be. So thank you again for this.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of copies of the Keston newsletter, the latest one that we publish in the UK. It is available online. I'm sorry there are only two. I brought such a huge amount of stuff for the Keston archive. My case, as those who carried it will know, it was almost too heavy to bring on the airline, so I didn't bring many copies of this, but there are a couple which you can take from the table.
And as you entered the room, I think all of you were given a copy of the program for the symposium. It continues starting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock here, 8:30, but here downstairs in